Things Hidden. And this is David Gornoski for our Things Hidden podcast, and we're happy that you could join us again. And today is a very special treat because I have a noted and acclaimed historian, someone who's written books that have really shaped the conversation for history for a variety of topics, but most notably for his new book out, which is making a great conversation for many people around the world on the impact of Christianity. His name is Tom Holland. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm so glad that we could connect. I've been really enjoying your book. It's called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And I've really enjoyed taking it with me as a companion in my travels these last several weeks. And wanted to say thanks for writing this because this is right up my alley in this program's conversation.
Oh, well, thanks very much. I hope it wasn't too heavy.
That was a problem. I said, I'm going to have to switch to the audiobook, so I did switch to the audiobook at some point. And I said, this is a little big for lugging around everywhere. But I do appreciate you putting this together. I am someone who pulls from a variety of different sources, but one that I really want to help popularize into the public conversation is the work of René Girard. Are you familiar with Girard's work?
I read him several years ago. I didn't read him as part of the research for this book. The European philosopher who was the big impact on the writing of this book was Nietzsche.
Yes.
Unlike Girard.
Yes. And he was
definitely not a Christian.
Well, Girard was very much influenced by Nietzsche as well. So let's just try to set the table here because we're going to try to give a sweep of your book. But how was Nietzsche a very pivotal figure for the writing of this book, Dominion?
Well, my background is in the writing of ancient history, and that was a fascination that I had from childhood. I was raised a Christian, but I'm going to be honest, when I thought of Jesus in front of Pontius Pilate, I was very much on the side of Pontius Pilate. And what I liked about the Romans was their carnivorous quality, their glamour, their allure, but also their cruelty. Mm-hmm. And I found Christianity faintly drab and dull in comparison. And I essentially resented them for, as I saw it as a child, destroying the Roman Empire. You had gladiators and legionaries, and then suddenly they all turned into monks. So I had a kind of 18th century Enlightenment hostility to Christianity. However, the process of writing about classical antiquity, which I then did as an adult, trying to get inside the minds of the Romans. And the more I did it, the more alien and frightening I found them. And I began to realize that the childhood sense of identification I'd had with them was a kind of folly, that they were nothing like me, and they were frankly terrifying.
Right.
And so essentially, Dominion is a product of that realization, a product of the realization that in the fundamentals, I'm actually deeply Christian. I'm not a Roman at all. And the reason that Nietzsche cast such an interesting light on that is that Nietzsche was a classicist, and Nietzsche was deeply drawn to the cruelty and the glamour and the predatory allure of the classical heroes, of Achilles and so on, the Homeric heroes. And he continued to adore that. He valued the qualities of strength and indeed cruelty that he found in the classical world. And he despised Christianity for everything that I had come to kind of value. Nietzsche regarded Christianity famously, notoriously, as a slave religion. And he saw it as a religion that had weaponized weakness against the strong. And he detested that. But there's a kind of bracing quality to that brings home to you actually far more vividly than any number of overtly apologist Christian writings. Just what it is about Christianity that is so distinctive particularly when placed in the context of the classical world from which it emerged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you've touched upon something very important, and I think Nietzsche recovers the full picture. He's one of my favorites for understanding Christianity too. Of course, he goes in a different direction too, but most, I would say, the average Christian and the average Christian opponent of the faith have a Cartesian model, and I'm not picking on René Descartes, but just kind of in a simplified term, just a Cartesian model more concerned with mental assent to propositional claims being the full totality of what it means to be a Christian. Okay, you're a Christian, you believe X, Y, Z. Do you believe in this person? Is he a Trinity? Do you have the correct description of a Trinity in your mind when you say you believe in a Trinity? It's very Cartesian head knowledge type things. Do you believe that these news events happened? Yes. It's kind of like this, it's kind of like the way Christianity is truncated by its advocates and critics. It's almost as if, like, if I'm in America, and you're telling someone, a young African American, well, the only way the impact of Martin Luther King can have an impact on your life is if you truly believe he existed and that he did these certain things, and you accept these certain things that he did, and then you will experience the effect of Martin Luther King's impact in history, as opposed to, no, it's a felt, real impact that's happened, whether you believe about the story of this person or not. You're in the fishbowl, and that's kind of what you're getting at, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's what Nietzsche says as well, that essentially a huge amount of what people would imagine is a kind of atheist repudiation of Christianity is merely a recalibration of Christian assumptions.
Right.
That he's highly contemptuous of philosophers as secret priests. He sees socialists and communists and Democrats and humanists as merely so many versions of Christians. And I think that you only have to look at the new atheists, celebrity atheists, to realize that their ethics and their morals in their essentials are deeply informed by Christianity. And what is bracing about Nietzsche is precisely that he is prepared to stare into the abyss of what it would mean not to be Christian, genuinely not to be Christian, to repudiate the values that essentially are kind of embodied in the cross. And Nietzsche looks at the cross and he is shocked by it in the way that Paul, the earliest Christian writer we have, is similarly shocked. He recognizes the idea of transforming an emblem of torture and of the power of an empire to inflict on those who oppose it torture into a symbol of the power of the weak to conquer the strong, of the powerless to triumph over those who use the cross to display their power. And he looks at that and he sees that as something shocking, revolting, horrific. But Paul, as well, in the same way, he also is alert to just how shocking it is. And I think that in between the vast sweep of time between those two men, between Paul and Nietzsche, most of us have become desensitized to the revolutionary quality of what is embodied within that cross.
And like you alluded to, Paul quotes Jesus saying, my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's a very kind of puzzling sentence, right? And we always, if I'm honest with myself, it's hard to even begin to take that seriously, right? As soon as someone, as soon as you say, well, that's an interesting concept, and most Christians like to turn that into a spiritual detachment from everyday affairs and politics and so forth. But that's not at all, I think, what's going on there in that text.
Are we? I think that after 2,000 years of Christianity, we are able to accept that. I think.
I think so.
A far more kind of shocking idea for people in that Paul is speaking to, because I think that we've been kind of conditioned by 2,000 years of Christianity to accept that actually there is a kind of strength in weakness. Mm-hmm. That's surely very evident in contemporary politics. The whole idea of intersectional, the idea that
Right.
there is a kind of hierarchy in where you stand in the level of oppression. I think that's kind of quite a vital aspect of contemporary politics and culture.
So in that sense, when Jesus quotes Habakkuk 2, when he's going into Jerusalem for his climactic showdown with the authorities of his time, he quotes Habakkuk 2, the prophet, and that basically the passage of that alludes to the fact that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the world as the ocean is wet. And in some sense, if we're thinking of it in the way that we're talking about it, which is, I think, the correct way, that's actually coming to pass. The knowledge of the Lord being power is perfected in weakness, in the last becoming first, right? And the idea that that you, in order to gain power in the West, you must have some kind of, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad. It's just an effect. It's a description.
A narrative that you are that you suffered, that you've been victimized, that you've been oppressed. I think that is something that can absolutely be turned against the people who are characterized as the oppressor.
Right.
And I think that is the great moral legacy of Christianity, and it's a legacy that would have meant nothing to the Romans at all. I mean, it would have bewildered them.
Do you think Jesus had that in mind? I mean, I know that's kind of a weird question, but do you think Jesus kind of had that concept in mind about what he was doing when he's quoting these prophecies, saying, the knowledge of the Lord? Do you think he considered the knowledge of the Lord to be this concern for the victim that we're seeing evident all over the West and everywhere?
I wouldn't presume that I would know what Jesus is thinking. But I think the interesting figure always is Paul, because from the historian's point of view, rather than from the theologian's point of view, Paul's letters are the earliest Christian texts that we have. And they are a decade or so from the likely date of Jesus' crucifixion. And although the account of how Paul becomes a Christian that we get in the Acts of the Apostles is several decades later and probably unreliable as an exact account of the historicity of what happened, you do in Paul's letters, it's evident that he had some overwhelming experience in which the crucified Jesus appeared to him, and that this was some transformative understanding. And so therefore, you have to wonder, how did this affect Paul, and how was it that he then came to become the missionary that we know, writing the letters that we have? And he never says that, but it seems likely that if Paul was persecuting Christians, followers of Jesus, for believing that this man, this criminal who had suffered the death of a slave, was in some way a part of the one creator God of Israel, he has to make sense of this. He has to make sense of the fact that this person who he had thought was just a criminal, in fact, is what his followers had said. That's what he's come to think. And therefore, he's got to think out why. How is this possible? And the only way that I can imagine that he does this is that he's a Pharisee, he is a scholar, he's been raised in the scriptural tradition. He must have gone away and he must have read through the scriptures, and he must have focused on everything that dwelt on the notion that actually the great transformation, the great turning point, the great rupture in the state of things that was promised in scriptures was going to be done through the humiliation and death of God. And that is what Paul finds, and that's the blinding realization. It's not just the vision, it's the vision as mediated by his reading of Scripture.
Right.
And I think that is what then lies in these foundational texts, which are the earliest record we have of what somebody who followed Jesus and believed that he's risen from the dead actually believes had happened.
And I wanted to go back briefly to something you said about your childhood. You said, you were kind of rooting for Pontius Pilate's side when you read the account of his trial of Jesus there. And, I think that's kind of the point of the text. It reminded me of when you said that, of something I kind of stumbled onto a little while ago about how some of the ancient manuscripts of Matthew 27:16, where it's talking about this story, have the full name of Barabbas as Jesus Barabbas. You know, and so there's a tale of two Jesuses there in the story, right? And the crowd is given a choice. You know, who do you want to set free, and who do you want to see, have be murdered, executed? And they choose they choose Jesus. The Barabbas was not just, as it's typically understood in Sunday school lessons, to just be a raving murderer. The text seems to indicate the word that they use for him is a revolutionary. He was a zealot. He was trying to overthrow the oppressors by force. And so you've got two types of kind of heroes, two types of Jesuses here. You've got the Jesus Barabbas, son of the Father is what that word means. You got two Jesuses of the Father, and the crowd chooses the violent Jesus in their image, and they've been choosing that Jesus most of the time since this story was recorded. And I think that's kind of the point, isn't it?
Yeah, but also think of Pilate. The crowd invoked the name of Caesar, and the fastest growing cult in the first century AD is not Christianity. It's a cult that worships another son of a god who has brought peace to the entire world, who has died and ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of his father, and that's Caesar Augustus. Right. And there is a sense in which Paul's letters and indeed the Gospels as well are riffing on that too. The way in which the idea of Jesus, a man executed by the Romans, the way that it enshrines him as the son of a god, it's an immense parody of the cult of Caesar.
Right. Yeah, I see that. And I see that even in the story of, just to add to your point there, the story of when Paul encounters Jesus on the road there to Damascus. And there he has that line where, Jesus says, Paul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks or against the goads. And that was a line that was popular, and it was popularized by the play, the Bacchae, which was a very, very prominent play in that time in the Greek-speaking culture. And, that's a line that Dionysus, the god of the crowd, says to King Pentheus when he's on trial. When King Pentheus puts him on trial, he says, well, you think you can do this to me, but it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. You can run, but you can't hide. You know what I mean? I'm the god here, and I'm in control. And then sure enough, at the end of the Bacchae play, Dionysus and his cult of followers end up tearing King Pentheus apart piece by piece in the same image of the Dionysian origin story itself. So you see that same mythic pattern of collective violence being justified in that myth. Well, you see Paul quoting and putting Dionysus' own line, kind of like our equivalent of quoting the Terminator by saying, I'll be back. I'll be back. And you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. I got it. You know what I mean? I know what you're referencing there. And he's putting Dionysus' own words into Jesus' words as he meets Paul, but in this case, it's not to tear him apart, but to offer him forgiveness and give him the same mission that he has. And
I think it's also I think it's implicit in Paul's letters. I think it's implicit in the Gospels, but it becomes increasingly explicit that the life of Jesus, even indeed the birth of Jesus, is a point at which the old gods are being driven from their horns.
Right.
So there's a famous story that's recorded in Plutarch, who's writing in 2nd century AD, where he's writing about an event that happens in the reign of Tiberius, the Caesar under whom Jesus is executed. And a sailor is on a ship, and he hears a great cry going up from an island off Greece, saying the great god Pan is dead, and there's echoes across the sea. Of course, Plutarch knew nothing about Jesus, wasn't on his mind, but later Christians, of course, seize on this as evidence that the coming of Jesus has resulted in the death of Pan. And when within a century of Jesus' death, you've got someone like Ignatius of Antioch, who is writing about how the birth of Jesus Christmas as it will become, that this is that gods are being banished at the point of his birth. And this becomes a kind of enduring motif throughout Christian history and indeed literature. So Milton's first great poem is about Christmas, and he describes all the gods being scoured from their temples, from their shrines, from their oracles. And I think the primal god who gets scoured from his temple, as the history of the relationship of Christianity to the Roman Empire demonstrates, is Caesar himself, the divine Caesar, Augustus in particular.
Yeah, I see that. And so, it's obvious that Christianity has had an immense impact on shaping the Western world in a way that's unparalleled, in my opinion. And I think you make a very good case for that here. And it's not, it's not as if this is it's not a whitewashing at all of the tradition of Christians working it out. Far from it. It's funny. I actually enjoyed some of the, when I was reading through the thick of some of the different Christian conflicts and tit for tat theological squabblings. I said, man, it makes me, I guess it's just part of our human nature. It made me yearn for the earlier portion of the book where it was more, over the top violence and tortures. I said, man, that was so much more exciting than these guys squabbling about everything. So.
Well, you see, that's kind of what we started this conversation off by talking about, that there is a kind of a clarity to the brutality of Julius Caesar slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another.
And that thing you described about them, was it the ancient Persians cutting up and
the scaphe?
Oh my goodness,
yes.
With the tree,
the most revolting torture. Yes.
I mean, I can't even talk about this on that podcast without. It's just too much. It's just,
yes, and it's right in the first chapter.
Yeah, I know. It's a great way.
I won't tell the listeners what it is, but if you get to read the book, you'll know it when you read it.
Yeah, it hits you.
The most revolting torture ever devised. And actually, one of the themes of the book is that those who think that they're enemies of Christianity invariably are not. That they are. With it, they continue to subscribe to Christian ethics and morals. That their assumptions are deeply Christian. That their metaphors, that their frames of reference, that the standards by which they condemn Christianity, all of them in their essentials are Christian. But there are one or two figures who genuinely do repudiate Christianity. Nietzsche, we've talked about one, but another is the Marquis de Sade, who values the free Christian world precisely because its capacity for torture was so great.
Right.
And although the Marquis de Sade recognizes that Christians too are capable of unspeakable cruelty, what he resents about Christians is that they feel guilty about it. Right. The Marquis de Sade wants to revel in a capacity for cruelty that is uncomplicated. And he enshrines the Persians as absolute models of torturers. For him, the Persians are the acme of those who inflict pain.
Do you see the Gospels as a type of technology? I mean, think about how much progress and change these texts have had in shaping the unique character of our tradition, our history in the West, and now the globe because of globalism and many countries imitating the West. For good and bad, but do you see it as a kind of technology, just allowing us to do things and see? If you have glasses, you can see something you couldn't see before, and so if you have a certain perspective that allows you to put away barbaric ancient practices like torturing people, or at least be pricked by the process of doing it over and over. Well, you know what I mean? It has an effect.
Christians, of course, continue to torture,
right?
And they continue to wage war, and they continue to conquer, and they continue to do all the things that humans have done, forever. The difference is that they are always aware that if they are believing Christians, that their Savior and Lord was himself tortured to death.
Right.
And so, therefore, they cannot inflict brutalities without some degree of violence to their consciences.
Right.
Whereas someone like Caesar, he can slaughter 1 million Gauls without undue. He doesn't seem to have been worried about it at all. And indeed, he parades through the streets of Rome and is cheered for it. So I think that is that sense of anxiety, that sense that God's law is written on the heart, and you could read there that actions that in a previous age would have been unproblematic, that there on your heart is written its condemnation because that's where God's law is written. And so the notion of conscience as a guide is, I think, something new, even though the word for it that Paul uses, synodasis, actually comes from the Stoics.
Right.
But I think it's kind of weaponized by Christian moralists. And so there's always that tension there. And it's kind of, this, the paradox of Christianity is that you can worship a man tortured to death on a cross as a god and recognize in his pain and his suffering the fulfillment of the divine purpose of the universe. And you can believe that so powerfully that you can end up torturing to death people who do not believe
right.
in this tortured God.
But it reminds me kind of...
And that is the great paradox of Christian charity, that it has a shadow, which is Christian persecution.
Right.
Christian love is shadowed by Christian violence.
But it's always violence that has to be done, at least publicly signaled, to be in the name of a victim or in the name of the defense of the persecuted in some way. It's always violence in the name of some kind of pale, mutated form of Christian, concern for the least of these. We have to do this kind of thing because this person is a monster who's trying to harm the victims or hurt the persecuted or something like that, or pollute the minds of the masses with heresy that will send them to hell. So,
it's there right from the beginning.
Right.
It's there right from the beginning. So if you think of Paul writing to the Galatians, and he says that in Christ Jesus there is no Jew or Greek, there's no man or woman, there's no slave or free.
Right.
And there, in a way, that's a foundational text for modern liberal societies. The idea that that men and women should be equal, that there should be that differences of class should be dissolved, and that differences of ethnicity should be dissolved, and differences of culture. And this, this is kind of the best of that. This is we are the world. This is kind of universalist idea that we are all brothers and sisters. But there is a catch there, because say you're a Jew and you don't want to have your distinctiveness, your cultural distinctiveness, dissolved into a kind of universalist mush, then you might actually find this rather threatening and you might stand against it. And Paul discovers to his shock that most Jews are not persuaded by what he's saying. They don't want to think that Jews and Greeks are one. And so right from the beginning, the Jews are always the objects of suspicion from Christians for rejecting what Christians see as a kind of universal message of love.
Right.
And so you only have to look at the history of Christian persecution of the Jews to recognize that kind of repudiated sense of love leads to hate.
Right.
And it's a kind of great shadow that hangs over that spreads over everything that is noblest and purest about Christianity and Christian history.
I think that kind of to add to your point there, it reminded me of a recent interview I had with a veteran of the Afghanistan War, as a Marine veteran who saw the first-hand effects of the Afghanistan conflict, named Ben Adams, who's been on my program. And he talked about how, we were good at doing what we were supposed to do originally, which was just to take out the mechanics and infrastructure that supported al-Qaeda in Afghanistan at the time. But that was a traditional military campaign. But then the secondary mission, which is what we've been over there for some time now, which is to nation build, which is to teach them to have the kind of society that we want them to have by force. He said, we can't do it. And he said, the kind of brutality that we would need to employ to make them submit to us by force, to do what we want them to do, to stop stoning their daughters or stop doing the different things that we're trying to get them to do. The level of brutality that we would need to publicly sanction as a culture is something that we would never stomach in America. And I thought it was a very good point. That illustrates exactly what you're saying, right? The barrenness of this, the impotence.
And that sense of anxiety that veteran expressed descends in a clear line of descent back to the reign of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor who is crowned as Caesar on Christmas Day, AD 800, and who claims to have refounded the Roman Empire. And Charlemagne is the first great Christian leader in the West who sees it as his duty to enforce Christianity at the point of the sword. Until then, no one had done that. He is trying to bring the Saxons, who are a pagan people living in the forests of Germany, to Christ. And the Saxons keep saying that they've converted and then burning down the churches and going back to the woods. And Charlemagne loses it and poses terrifying sanctions, slaughters huge numbers of recalcitrant Saxons, brings fire and bloodshed to the forests of Saxony. And his great counselor, his great guide, Alcuin, a monk from Northumbria, says to him, "You cannot do this. This is not how it should be done. Cannot bring to the Prince of Peace by the arts of war." And Charlemagne kind of tempers his ferocity and his fury, but by this point the Saxons are basically broken. So you have there something that's going to repeat throughout Christian history. The idea that sometimes, there are people who feel sometimes that you have to destroy people for their own good to bring them the benefits of what they might see as Christianity or civilization or whatever, and others who say, no, that risks destroying everything that we're trying to bring them. And it's a paradox that ultimately is unsolvable, and which American forces in Iraq or in Afghanistan continue to face, just as Charlemagne and Alcuin faced back in the 8th and 9th century.
Right. That the ways of Caesar are just simply incompatible with the ways of Christ. It's like if you want to force people through the force of government dictate and conquest or occupation or whatever, and say, we are going to force you to stop stoning, or else we might do things that are going to hurt you. It's kind of it's just oil and water. It doesn't mix. It simply doesn't mix.
And yet, I mean, another modern example, which is in the book, and kind of slightly touches on this, is the reaction to the Great Migration crisis that hit Europe in 2015, when something like 1 million refugees, most of them Muslim, came into the center of Europe. And I don't know if you remember, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, opened up the frontiers and allowed them in. And Merkel is the daughter of a Lutheran pastor, grew up in a parsonage where her father had particularly cared for those who were poor, who were suffering, who were weak. And so it's evident that the story of the Samaritan is something that Merkel completely grew up with. And it's evident that is a part of what persuaded her to open the frontiers of Germany to basically 1 million Muslims. But the country that borders Germany is Hungary. And Hungary is a country that had been occupied by the Ottomans, so a Muslim power for centuries. And the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, although grew up an atheist, now claims to be a Christian. And he said that he refused to allow Muslims into the country, the Muslim refugees, because he said that this would destroy the Christian character of Europe and destroy the Christian character of Hungary. Right. And that, too, is something, that too is a part of Christian history. So in 2015, in the heart of Europe, you have, again, another demonstration of the tension of this kind of Moebius strip that has always run through Christianity. Do you help, like the Samaritan, do you help the man who's injured on the road? Do you turn the other cheek? Do you put up your sword? But what if doing that means that you may lose the Christian character that encourages you to do that in the first place? And that's, these are paradoxes that have run the whole way through Christian history.
And these are the biggest...
Right the way back to the beginning.
Yeah, and these are the foundational questions for our political divides, at least in America I can speak for. You've just illustrated in Europe, but that's the fundamental debate behind so much of all these different issues.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's two political parties and so forth trying to fight over who's the most closely associated with the martyr's perch of whatever the issue is, and so, and that's the only way you can win is to try to see who gets to that perch fastest. If it's a gun control issue, well, who's the victim? Is it it's who's on the side of the persecuted ones? Are the persecuted ones the ones who will have their guns forcibly round up by government guns? If you're going to ban a gun, if there's 15 million AR-15s, are you going to go door to door? And who's going to get hurt in the scuffle if someone doesn't want to give it up? Or who's going to get hurt in the melee of that? Or is it the victim of the people who are caught in a school shooting and somehow the prevalence of an AR-15 is what allowed that to happen more likely? See, these are things that are all defined around who is on the side of the martyr, who's on the side of the martyr, and that's all it's about. So I think we're more Christianized than ever in terms of our capacity to think about things, even though we don't act like it, the way it's supposed to be, right?
Well, looking at America from outside, I get the sense that within America, the culture wars often expresses itself as being kind of Christians against liberals or progressives or however you want to put it. But from my perspective, it doesn't look like a war between Christians and progressives. It looks like a civil war between rival Christian factions. And there's almost no aspect of America's culture wars that don't seem to me essentially to revolve around rival Christian positions. So if you look at abortion, which I guess is a kind of classic lightning rod issue, obviously opposition to abortion is Catholic doctrine, but it's been fundamental Christian position right from the very beginning. And the expression of this back in antiquity was that Christians were regarded as very, very strange for thinking that abandoned children should be rescued. You have records of saints who would go around rubbish tips, finding discarded girls, bringing them up because they were the weakest, the lowest of the low. Generally, the abandoned girls would be picked up by slavers, raised to serve as prostitutes, and so on. So this was an act of charity, and people opposed to abortion are recognizably in a line of descent from that. That every Christian has a duty of care to those who are those who are vulnerable, those who are at the beginning of life.
Right.
But again, against that is stated the idea that women should have the choice, that women should have control over their own bodies, that it's no one else's choice to say what they should do. And that, again, is a deeply Christian idea, and it goes back, again, like so much does, to Paul and to Paul's letters, where he is saying that the ideal of a sexual relationship is that a man is like Christ, a woman is like the church, and that therefore if the woman is like the church, therefore she has a bodily integrity. Her virginity, her purity, her flesh, this has a kind of sacral quality, and therefore she has the right to say what people can do with it or what they cannot do with it. And the radicalism of this message in the context of assumptions that the Romans had about sexuality is hard to overemphasize, because Roman free males, Roman citizens, took for granted that they had the right to use their dependents, their female slaves, any way that they wanted. And so the Pauline message that, no, you cannot do that, is equally as radical as the idea that you should care for abandoned babies or not abort fetuses. And so the row, the argument, the culture war that revolves around abortion is essentially a war between two rival aspects of Christian theology.
Right, exactly. It's the first shall be last, last shall be first, and we're just trying to figure out the hierarchy of the last, how they become first, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And it's just fascinating. You have a chapter in there near the end of the book about the Me Too movement, and I was just thinking about that, how, you know, that's another Christian story about, again, tied into what you said about the integrity of women's sovereignty over their body and not to be used in vulgar ways and flippant ways, and how sensitive, how acutely sensitive we're becoming to this, even if we're not living up to it in the, you know, the underbelly of culture. And I thought, you know, and then I immediately did the whole Christian debate thing in my head, because then I thought about, like, the movie, you remember the movie Edward Scissorhands, right? And the famous 80s movie, and that character by Tim Burton, you know, he is falsely accused in the story by a woman of trying to assault her, just like Joseph was in the Bible, right? And so he's a Christ figure, because the whole mob comes for this Edward Scissorhand character, because this woman accuses him of a sexual assault, when in fact he was just a misfit. He was just a falsely accused misfit, and he has kind of a Christ archetype character in that movie, which obviously was a reflective of our culture. So you see in that story, you have, again, the Christian story of trying to protect the least of these, but also trying to protect scapegoats, right? In the Me Too. So how does this all work out? I mean, you're a history, obviously you're, you know, and again, you're not a futurist here. You're not here to predict the future, but I mean, we're really going in a certain direction rapidly, and I'm not sure what that's going to look like.
I think that Christianity and its influence is impossible to buck, is what I think.
Right.
And you mentioned Me Too. When I began writing this book, I was thinking about sexual morality as something. Christian sexual morality is something that did seem to be fading, because it did seem that since the 60s there had been a pretty drastic repudiation of Christian sexual standards, certainly, you know, in popular culture and in pretty much any aspect of it that you care to see it anywhere in the media, and therefore in broader life as well. And then the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, and the Me Too movement began, and the women marches began, and at no point really did anybody say about Harvey Weinstein, well, what's the problem? Why shouldn't a very powerful man have his sexual way with his inferiors and his subordinates? And the reason I say that is that in the Roman world, that would have been completely taken for granted. It would completely be taken. You know, one of the perks of being a citizen is that basically you can have sex with anyone you want who is your inferior, any way that you like.
Right.
But the response to the Harvey Weinstein scandal and everything else that followed on from that wasn't just that women objected to it. It was that men accepted the justice of what women were complaining about and protesting about.
Right.
And so what that suggests is that despite decades since the 60s, decades of sexual liberation, ultimately the moral assumption that a woman has a right to not be sexually harassed and that men should exercise self-restraint remains massively, massively taken for granted across American society. And again, the kind of the wonderful illustration of this paradox is that you remember the women's marches that followed Trump's election. Mm-hmm. And again, the most dramatic, the most visible figures in those marches were those who dressed up as handmaids from The Handmaid's Tale, right, in their red robes and their white bonnets. And The Handmaid's Tale, of course, is a parody of Puritan New England. But what was it that the women dressed as handmaids were demanding of men? That they display sexual continence exactly as Puritans did.
Sure.
So they're dressing up in the costume of a show and a book that satirizes Puritanism to demand a return of Puritanism.
Right. It's fascinating. And, you know, your book is so important. I think everybody should be reading this. And I hope we can do future discussions together. But, I was just thinking, no matter where you turn within the political, especially, like you said, in the American context, I just see it so fully saturated. I think you made the comment earlier just a minute ago that you can't escape the yoke of Christianity in these political and cultural conversations. Whether we have anything to do with the metaphysical claims of the faith or not, we're fully enmeshed in the fishbowl of Christianity, and I don't think we're going to get out of it. So in some sense, I guess Jesus was right when he said it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, right? Which is the metaphor of an ox can't get off the yoke. You can't get away from it.
Yeah.
It's happening.
Well, the metaphor, I was in LA a couple of years ago and went to La Brea and saw the tar pits. And the reason that all the animals were preserved in the tar pits is that once you get into the tar pit, the more you struggle, the more you sink.
Right.
And I think Christianity is a kind of great tar pit. And we're, however much you may struggle to get out of it, the more you struggle, the more you sink into it.
And that's the word they used, right? Scandalon, right? It's a scandalon.
Yep.
Well, very good. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Tom Holland, author of Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Did it remake any thoughts about your perception or interaction with Christianity? The book, writing the book, I should say. Yeah.
When I began.
You're more Christian now?
Yeah. I'm very conscious of the fact that in almost every way, I'm Christian.
So do you practice? Do you consider that to be just an ethical thing, or the whole metaphysical faith construct?
I'm working on it.
Well, that's what it's all about, right? Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks again. Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World by Tom Holland. Please check it out. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time, Tom.
Thanks a lot for having me.
This is David Gornoski with Things Hidden. You can email me, david@aneighborschoice.com. Thanks again for joining us.